That night I came home 2 days earlier than planned. Not to get a hug, but to find a letter from the hospital lying cold in the mailbox for 4 whole days. I hadn't even had time to process it when I was already standing in the ICU, watching Eleanor lying there motionless, and seeing Mark and Chloe by her bedside, acting calm, too calm. They told me it was just an old age accident, but the bruise on Eleanor's wrist told me a very different story. Before I go on, make sure you subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. I'm about to take you through the next moments. I still feel that heavy weight when I think back to that afternoon stepping into the mansion. The sunset spilled over Puget Sound, beautiful in a strange, eerie way. But all I could feel was a coldness, like a shroud, covering something on the brink of collapse. I had come home 48 hours early, hoping to take Eleanor out for dinner, a routine we'd kept for 42 years. But the house that once echoed with her footsteps was now hollow, stripped of life. On the table by the entrance, her bag sat there, neat in its place as if she had left in a hurry. But what froze me was the hospital letter wedged under a pile of flyers, an envelope that had sat there for 4 days without anyone bothering to bring it to me. I don't remember if I opened it with my hands, or with the anger rising inside me. All I know is the words, ICU, critical condition, pulled me straight into a darkness no preparation could reach. By the time I ran to the hospital, my breath still ragged, the ICU doors opened to a scene even harder to swallow, Eleanor lying motionless, machines beeping steadily, and Mark and Chloe standing at her bedside, calm, as if they were just visiting. No tears, no tension, just two faces so cold they felt alien to me. I swallowed the tremor in my voice and asked what had happened. Mark answered first, even-toned, emotionless. He said Eleanor slipped on the stairs. I'd seen many faces confronted with tragedy in my years as a lawyer. Denial, panic, feigned calm. But my son's calm, it was different. A kind of calm that made my spine chill. Chloe nodded along with every word, like they'd rehearsed this story more than once. I stepped closer to Eleanor's bed. When my old hand touched hers, I saw a dark bruise stretching across her wrist. Not a minor bump, not the kind of fall I'd seen in countless injury cases. This was a sign of force. Someone had held her, not to protect, but to control. My heart tightened with a slow, heavy beat. I asked Mark why he hadn't called me immediately. He said, "Dad, you were busy at the conference. I didn't want to worry you." Chloe added that everything was under control. I heard those words as if someone had slammed a hand onto my shoulders, pressing me down. Under control? Who gave them that right? They even suggested I go home and rest. A gentle suggestion, but in Mark's voice, I heard the tone of someone trying to push me out of the story. I stared at them for a few seconds, letting the weight of my gaze press down so they would understand I wasn't going to be pacified by a few comforting words. Mark avoided my eyes. Chloe stared at the floor. Neither looked like someone who had just watched their mother severely injured. I had taught Mark once that expressions are the easiest things to control in court. Apparently, he had listened, but in a way I had never wanted. I left the hospital as Seattle's sky began to drizzle. The rain fell on my shoulders icy, but not as cold as the suspicion that had begun to rise inside me. Suspicion that this slip was no accident. Suspicion that the 4 days of silence weren't mere oversight. Suspicion that Mark and Chloe's calm wasn't strength. It was the calm of people unafraid of being caught. Sitting in the car, I felt it clearly, all my years of legal experience, all the instincts that once let me see the heart of a person, were screaming that something twisted, abnormal, dangerous was happening right in my own family. And I, at 70, was stepping into a battle I never thought I'd face again. But looking back at the bruise on Eleanor's wrist, I knew one thing: I would see it through to the end, no matter how cruel the truth might be. I didn't drive straight home after leaving the hospital that night, under that freezing Seattle rain. I just circled the city, like a man with nowhere left to return to. Truth was, I was only trying to keep myself calm enough not to storm in and confront Mark right then and there. At 70, people think I've run out of fire. They're wrong. I've just learned to bury it under thicker ice. But the moment I pulled up to the gates of the mansion, whatever calm I had left cracked wide open. The familiar lights spilled across the steps, quiet, polished, staged, like a set prepared for a performance I never agreed to be in. I opened the door, stepped into the living room, and looked straight up the staircase. The same staircase where Mark said Eleanor slipped. I stood there for a long time. The stairs didn't speak, but the silence around them felt like a lie dressed as an accident. No scratches, no damage, nothing out of place. Everything too perfect, like nothing had ever happened. And in that silence, I knew what I needed answers. The kind you can only get one-way evidence. I went into my study. The room still carried that warm walnut smell, the place where Eleanor used to bring me tea every evening. But tonight, the only thing that broke the stillness was the startup chime of my computer, like a quiet knock from the truth itself. I logged into our family financial system, something I rarely dug into since Eleanor always handled everything with her usual care and precision. But this time, it took only a few minutes before something colder than that ICU room hit me. A withdrawal. $2.5 million. Taken from Eleanor's shared trust fund. During the week I was gone. And done just cleverly enough, the amount was pulled right below the threshold that required my signature. I leaned back in my chair. Not because of age, because I already knew who would dare do something like that. In this family, only Mark had access to the business accounts and the funds tied to our assets. But this wasn't just greed. It was precise, too precise. He knew the limits, knew the rules, knew how to slip through the cracks. And that scared me in a particular way. He learned those tricks from me. In that moment, I saw his calm expression again back in the ICU. Earlier, it had only felt suspicious. Now, it looked calculated. I kept digging through the archive files and found something even worse. Mark and Chloe had met with our old family attorney, Richard Hayes, the man who drafted Eleanor's will. Their appointment was scheduled exactly 3 days before Eleanor fell. I opened the autosync note Hayes had added to the archive. I read it line by line, like peeling skin off a snake. Mark requested an adjustment, remove the charitable donation Eleanor wanted to establish, and redirect that entire portion to him. I insisted Eleanor be present, but Mark said she was not healthy enough to attend. Eleanor, not healthy enough. 3 days before she fell, 3 days before she ended up motionless in the ICU. A cold shiver ran straight down my spine. Every piece snapped into place with that dry, brutal click only a man trained to read human lies would hear. I called Mark directly. I didn't yell. At my age, I don't need volume to intimidate anyone. I used the same voice I once used in court, the one that told a defendant their little scheme had just been stripped bare. I said, "You accessed your mother's fund. You met with Hayes behind our backs. From this moment on, every account you manage is frozen." On the other end, silence stretched, tight like a held breath. I thought he'd explain. But no. Mark let out a soft laugh. So flat, so empty, I had to clench my fist just to keep steady. Then he said Dad should take care of his health. I'd hate to see you have a stair accident. That sentence made me rise from my chair, not out of fear, but because I knew exactly what I'd just heard. Mark wasn't innocent. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't covering up. He was warning me. No, not warning, threatening. I closed the phone slowly, deliberately. Inside me, a storm was waking up. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't panicked. I just felt one thing sharper than everything else. If I didn't dig this to the end, the next one in the ICU could be me. And Eleanor might never have slipped at all. I looked up at the staircase again. Now it wasn't just a part of the house. It was a silent witness to an intentional crime. And I, an old man of 70 who thought he'd retired from every legal battlefield, was about to step into the last war of my life. After that threatening call from Mark, I knew I didn't have the luxury of sitting still and guessing anymore. I wasn't the old gullible father he thought I was. I was John Sterling, a man who'd stared down the best liars in court and made them confess with just a handful of questions. Mark might be my son, but pity wasn't going to cloud a single detail. That night, I went back to my study and opened our home security system. If I wanted to know what really happened the night Eleanor fell, I had to start with the one thing hardest to manipulate: the cameras. But the moment I logged in, I realized I was facing something more dangerous than deception. Someone had deliberately erased the footage. The staircase camera was disabled at the exact time of the so-called accident. The traces of tampering were clean, precise, not the work of someone acting on impulse. This was done by a person who knew what they were doing, or someone who had been coached very, very well. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the words, "No data found." For the first time in years, my hands trembled, just a little. But luck or fate chose my side. Hidden in the system was a secondary folder labeled Backup, Log. Normally, those files self-delete after 72 hours. But Mark had rushed his little cleanup job, and one unsynced backup remained on the server. A small mistake. But to me, it was an unintentional confession. I opened the file and let it process. Seconds later, the screen flickered with broken, blurry, distorted frames. But enough to show one crucial truth: there was no slip. Before I could study it, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but the instinct that saved me more times than I can count told me to answer. A young woman's voice trembled on the other end. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Alice. I used to take care of Mrs. Eleanor." I could hear fear in every word. I can't stay quiet anymore." I sat up straight. Alice told me that on the night of the accident she arrived at her usual time. But Mark and Chloe were already at the door. Mark said Eleanor wasn't feeling well, and told Alice to take the night off. Even offered her some extra cash to avoid questions. Alice isn't someone who bends for a little money. She got worried, asked why Eleanor wasn't well. Chloe just repeated, "Go home. We don't need you tonight." According to Alice, as the door closed, she heard shouting inside. Eleanor's voice strained, frightened, angry. Mark's voice heavy, sharp, the same tone I'd heard on the phone just hours earlier. Alice wanted to call me, but she knew Mark was trying to control everything. She was afraid she'd only make things worse. When she stopped talking, I stayed silent for a long time. Every detail, every sentence, every sound of my son's voice braided itself into a picture darker than anything I'd imagined. I thanked Alice, told her to stay safe, and not to contact Mark again, ever. I hung up with a hand cold as steel. I took a slow breath and reopened the backup footage. What Mark tried to erase was right there. A clip only a few seconds long, blurry off-angle, but clear enough to destroy their entire story. I saw Eleanor at the top of the stairs, stepping back, her face tight, not with imbalance, but with fear. And in front of her, Chloe. In a brief, unmistakable moment, Chloe shoved her. Not an accident, not a slip, a deliberate push. A heartbeat later, Mark appeared at the lower steps, looking up as if he had been waiting for something to happen. I didn't move. My pulse was slow, steady, but each beat hit like a hammer. My wife didn't fall because of age. She was attacked by the very people she once called family. In that silent study, a coldness settled over me, not the cold of weather or age, but the kind that comes when truth stands in full form before you and leaves no room to retreat. I stood, walked toward the window, watched the Seattle rain fall over Puget Sound. Each drop hitting the glass felt like a reminder that if I had been one day later, I might have lost Eleanor forever. But I knew I couldn't take this evidence straight to the police. Mark and Chloe were smart, calculated. They had their own lawyer and enough cunning to spin a new narrative. I needed a strategy, a strike they couldn't escape from. This wasn't about money anymore, not about the will, not about family power. This was a fight for Eleanor's life, and I, an old man of 70, wasn't going to lose. I walked out of Elise's office with a strange mix of clarity and ice running down my spine. The bank statements she handed me, those disappearing amounts, small here, small there, but adding up to something enormous, felt like they were pounding inside my jacket pocket, warning me with every step. But I knew financial evidence alone wasn't enough. If I wanted to drag Mark and Chloe out of whatever shadows they were hiding in, I needed to find the one thing they feared most, the truth they'd tried to bury. And one little detail from Elise's words kept circling in my mind. Lately, Mrs. Eleanor asked me to retrieve the files from the Sterling Charity Fund from 1989. Why would Eleanor want to look at those old papers, and why would she have to find them herself instead of asking Mark, the one supposedly overseeing all the family accounts? I stepped into the elevator, my hand still gripping the documents. When the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the steel, an old man of 70, hollow-eyed, worn, but no longer soft. I remembered the look Eleanor gave me before she collapsed. The fear trembling at the corner of her mouth, like she had something to say something. Mark and Chloe made damn sure she never got the chance to speak. Outside the building, I called a taxi and brought the files back to our old apartment. I needed to be somewhere. Her presence still lingered. Somewhere my emotions couldn't slip past my judgment. The apartment was dark, cold. I turned on Eleanor's favorite lamp, the warm, soft light just enough to read by. And then the truth unfolded. The transfers from the Sterling Charity Fund hadn't just been quiet, they'd been redirected into strange accounts. Accounts tied to names I'd heard thrown around in those whispered conversations between Mark and Chloe. They called it an advisory committee, but somehow they never once showed me a single member. I read every line of every statement. The deeper I went, the tighter my hand clenched. Those kids thought I knew nothing about finance, nothing about bookkeeping tricks. They forgot. I spent over 5 decades running Sterling Group before handing the reins to Mark. I wasn't ignorant. I was trusting. And that mistake was something Eleanor was paying for. But that wasn't what stopped my breath. I found a handwritten note, shaky but familiar. Eleanor's handwriting. The handwriting I could recognize even in total darkness. If I don't get the chance to say it, look in the steel box in the study. Don't let them take it. My chest tightened like someone had reached in and twisted. Eleanor knew. She had known something and she had been afraid. Afraid enough to leave a message like that. I stood up immediately, almost ran to the study. The steel box she mentioned wasn't an ordinary box. It was one I gave her years ago, biometric lock, with her fingerprint and a spare key I kept in the safe. I had practically forgotten it existed, or maybe I just never imagined I'd need it again. When the lid clicked, open a thick stack of yellowed documents appeared. On top was the old version of Eleanor's will, the one I remembered clearly. The one where she left her entire share to the charity fund and only kept a small portion for the family. But the version Mark brought to the lawyer last week was nothing like this. Nothing. I flipped through the rest, and my blood went cold. Financial evidence, ledgers, contract copies, secret notes Eleanor had written marking every irregularity she'd found. She hadn't dared confront Mark directly, but she documented everything, as if she already knew she'd need proof one day. And then at the bottom I found the thing that nearly made my knees buckle. A small audio recorder, the one Eleanor used when practicing speeches. I pressed play, her voice weak but steady. If you're hearing this, it means I'm out of time. Mark and Chloe, they're hiding something from you. They don't want you to know about the fund. I'm scared they'll do something reckless. If anything happens to me, you have to check. I sank into the chair, my fist tightening until my knuckles turned pale. Not from shock, but from the coldness crawling through every vertebra in my back. Eleanor didn't fall because of age. She fell because she was terrified, fighting to protect this family from the very people she once loved. And I, the old husband, who thought everything was still under control, had let her fight alone. I drew in a long, steady breath. Then I stood, packed every document into a leather case. I knew exactly what I had to do now. I wasn't going to be the gentle old man in the kitchen making tea anymore. I was going to be the man Eleanor once trusted to lead this family. And this time, I would lead it all the way to the truth. I stepped into the living room, Eleanor's documents heavy in my hands, the weight more tangible than ever. I was holding everything needed to end this game. Mark and Chloe still believed they were in control, that I was just a 70-year-old man with a collection of memories and patience. They were wrong. This time, I was in command. I called Mark and Chloe to the mansion under the pretext of a temporary handover of company control due to my frail health. My voice was calm, measured, revealing nothing of the storm within. Yet every step I took, every glance I gave them, carried a warning they were entering a territory I had prepared. When they arrived, Mark's fake smile made me want to curl my lips in response. Chloe stood beside him, clutching her handbag like a shield. They did not yet know. From this very moment, any attempt to deceive would be meaningless. I placed the stack of documents on the table and opened it, but did not speak. They looked at me confused by my terrifying composure. I emphasized, "You will sign these documents to take temporary control of the company." I handed over pages filled with complex legal language, small print, yet in their hands lay the undeniable truth. Everything was prepared, so Mark and Chloe would sign, admitting financial fraud, tampering with the will and evidence, manipulation. Mark skimmed through the pages, his smile fading line by line. Chloe grew visibly nervous. I stood silently, letting the tension sink in moment by moment. I did not need to shout. Silence paired with carefully arranged legal phrasing was my weapon. They signed one signature, then another, without complaint, because everything they were signing was an admission of their own guilt. I looked into their eyes, and in that brief moment, I saw fear. Fear because they realized they had lost, but did not yet know the consequences. As soon as the papers were complete, I smiled. You have just signed your confessions and transferred all your rights to Eleanor. The police now have everything they need. I had hidden cameras in the room, streaming live to my lawyer's office and the Seattle Police Department. They never saw it coming. Mark growled. Chloe panicked, but it was too late. The tension on their faces melted into despair, then into hopelessness. I did nothing further. I simply stood there, a statue of law, experience, justice, the very things they thought they had stolen. The police stormed in. Mark and Chloe tried to resist, but the evidence was irrefutable. The recording, the camera footage, the financial records, Alice's testimony. No escape remained. They were escorted to the car, faces twisted by anger, fear, and regret. I stood silently watching them leave, heavy yet relieved. Justice had been served, without bloodshed, without shouting. When the living room returned to quiet, I turned to Eleanor. She lay in her hospital bed, frail, yet her eyes brightened as she saw me. I held her hand, still warm, and a weak but powerful smile appeared on her lips. I knew Eleanor realized. She was no longer alone. We had won, not through violence, but through intellect, strategy, love, and trust. The next day, Eleanor began physical therapy, step by step, movement by movement, yet her spirit remained strong. I sat beside her, hand in hand, witnessing her recovery. What she endured, pain, betrayal, fear, would never be forgotten. But the important thing, she survived, and that survival was the greatest victory. We decided to use $2,500,000, which Mark had tried to steal, to establish the Eternal Love Foundation in Seattle. The fund would support elderly victims of domestic abuse and financial deception perpetrated by their own children. Eleanor held my hand, eyes glistening. We will leave behind something good instead of hatred. I nodded. Life had taught me. Revenge only relieves emotions. Legacy, love, and justice endure. Mark and Chloe were sentenced severely. No one could deny the mountain of evidence. They were held accountable for every act. For me, this was not just justice for Eleanor. It was proof that at 70, intellect and family love remained powerful enough to defeat greed and deceit. Sitting by the window, looking out at Puget Sound on the first morning after the storm, I realized the most important thing, true legacy, is not money, not shares, but the values we leave behind for the world and the people we love. Eleanor smiled at me, and in her eyes I saw peace. A peace born from justice, from love, from the inner strength we had reclaimed together. And this time, I knew we would never allow anyone, whether son or daughter-in-law, to violate our family, to harm Eleanor, or the life values we cherish. Seattle's sunrise blazed, and I felt it clearly. Life still holds so much beauty to fight for, to protect, and to love. My story ends here. If today's story touched your heart and kept your eyes glued to the screen, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next emotional family tale. Thank you for being with us, and see you in the next deeply moving episode.